I pray now that you fill my mind with your thoughts, my heart with your feelings, and my mouth with your words, and let your Spirit guide me now so that what I offer would be to your glory. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right. It's appropriate that I begin with prayer because I have to tell you that my presence here today is definitely at the behest and calling of God, as it is He who has placed a desire in my heart to better understand why I am still an Episcopalian after almost 55 years. And at the core of that quest lies a deep longing for me to better understand the power and uses of the Book of Common Prayer, because it has always been so instrumental in my life and in my earliest spiritual experiences, and it has been a part of my life always. And here sits my mother, who came today, and she is the one who first put the Book of Common Prayer in my hands. When I first began doing research for this project, I ran across this quote from one commentator, which I found quite fascinating. The Book of Common Prayer is not a prayer book in the sense of that it is a collection of separate prayers. It is more like a playbook. The script actors use for performing a play. In this case, the acts to be performed are acts of worship, religious exercises in which prayers are important components, but not the only ones. The players or participants must know what to do and how to follow along, and the texts of the Book of Common Prayer make that possible. Consequently, worshiping with the Book of Common Prayer conforms to a set of patterns. Now, I had never really thought of the Book of Common Prayer as having any other purpose than just that, prayer. But it struck me that there certainly was and still is a need for something that gives structure and uniformity to worship, particularly when we worship together in community. That being said, back in the 16th century, where the Book of Common Prayer is genesis, if you will, achieving uniformity in worship was not the easy task that it is today for a variety of reasons. Most worshipers in the 16th century were not all able to read, nor did churches have resources to provide people who were literate with printed books. And there were a number of different books, believe it or not, in use for all the different groups of peoples and different occasions and services. So that leads us to examine the origins of the Book of Common Prayer. From where did it come? And it certainly is tied in a sense to the Missal. And the Missal came from as far back as the 10th century and enabled a single priest to celebrate the Mass on his own without being encumbered by all the various other books that were in existence and that had been copied out for use by other ministers during the more participatory style of Mass of the 6th and 7th centuries. The Missal was a book of convenience in that it allowed the priest to walk to the side altar in one of those large medieval churches, and I tried to picture in my mind what that would have looked like. I imagine it was larger than this church. Carrying the chalice and the paten with all the necessary linens, preceded by a server carrying a book that contained everything that he needed to be able to recite the Mass at the altar, regardless of who was in the congregation. And this was in the case of a regular Mass. If it was a higher Mass or other ministers were involved, then there were other, of course, participants in other books. While the Mass is most certainly the most frequent act of worship at the time, it was not the only service in existence. In the Church of England as it existed before the Reformation, there were 4 distinct recognized volumes that were in use to conduct all services. The Book of Daily Services was known as the Breviary. The Missal, of course, was the book used in the celebration of the Holy Communion. The Ritual was the book of special offices, and my favorite, the Pica, could only be used by the bishop. It was nicknamed the Pie, and from whence the saying, easiest pie, comes. The Pica was a directory that set out instructions for the saying of services, and its purpose was to help sacristans and others involved in the preparation of services behind the scenes know which readings, antiphons, and prayers should be used on any given occasion. The Pica was generally quite complicated due to the sheer number of feasts of different grades and having precedence over others on certain Sundays. And I love this because it helps me understand why now, as a modern-day sacristan, I cannot seem to learn the name of anything in the sacristy. Now I know why. But it also gives me that connection too, and it makes me, I enjoy that deep connection to the Middle Ages. place at different set times in the day, and John has already referred to this. These customs have their origin in the early monastic tradition, particularly the rule of Saint Benedict from the 6th century. The recent origins of the first Book of Common Prayer lie partly within the rule of Saint Benedict. The Benedictines were the most influential monks in England, and they had all the large cathedrals at the time. So their practices shaped the way English folk prayed daily. The term daily office, which has always puzzled me greatly if you look in the back of your prayer book, comes from the Latin term meaning divine service of duty. At the eve of the Reformation, the practice of reciting the daily offices in two main blocks, as we have discussed this morning and evening, had become the norm. All right, we talked about the origins. Now, what were the purposes of the Book of Common Prayer? Why was there even a need for such a thing? Its original motivations were doctrinal. That is, it was time to put the Reformation teaching into praying words. It was social, to spread the use of the vernacular, and finally, it was also liturgical, to bring together the main services of the Reformed Church of England. Now remember, few laity could read, but they could all understand English. And while in the beginning the text wasn't in English, the winds of change were blowing in England, and the Reformation loomed on the immediate horizon. Therefore, there was a need for a book. The Book of Common Prayer, then, provisional as it came to be, because we know it's been revised many times, was certainly in part a child of the printing press, and it would be remiss of me to not give credit to Johann Gutenberg for his part. Its effects, the Book of Common Prayer's effects and legacy would have been impossible without the printing press. Before Johann Gutenberg's marvelous innovation, you need to try to picture this in your mind, books had to be laboriously copied by hand, or painstakingly produced as block books, in which a large page of text was carved in mirror image relief on a wooden block, and then transferred by laying a sheet of paper on the inked block and burnishing it or rubbing it. That was a rather laborious process. What Gutenberg did is he came up with movable metal type. So, which, having worked in the printing industry before, I can tell you it wasn't too many years ago that gave way to everything that became digitized. But movable metal type allowed them to form words, link them together, and then print a page. Smart. So that really helped with the proliferation of the Book of Common Prayer. But we all know that all great works of anything, literature, music, all have to have an author or a composer, and the Book of Common Prayer is no different. It owes its character above all to one man, Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury from 1533 to 1556. While the liturgy of the prayer book is sometimes described as timeless, it is in fact rooted firmly in the time of the Reformation and in Cranmer's personal views and character. And he was a character, in my opinion. Ordained in 1520, he was among the first theologians involved in the negotiations of what was known as the Great Matter, that is, Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and his first published work backed Henry's case. His Reformation sympathies, y'all are going to love this, however, didn't surface until he visited Nuremberg in 1532 and saw the Lutheran Reformation at work. However, he secretly married the niece of a reformer, an act that was illegal for an English priest. Upon his return to England, he found his desire for reform constrained by royal policy. It's said that he brought her back to England in a box and hid her out. I don't know if that's true or not. I find it interesting that he became a reformer once he met a woman. Upon his return to England, as I said, Cranmer found his desire for reform constrained by royal policy. The king, this is still Henry VIII, was of course, as we all know, still Catholic at heart. And in June of 1539, the reform door slammed shut with the issuance of his 6 articles, which affirmed traditional teachings. It wasn't until 1546 that Cranmer was able to secure and abolish certain ceremonies and customs that were considered superstitious. Now, it was the death of Henry VIII and the accession of his son, Edward VI, in January of 1547, that truly allowed the English reformers to move forward. Under Edward, who was Henry's son with his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, the Book of Homilies was published in June 1547. This book contained a theology amenable to the Reformation important to note that both Cranmer's prayer books retained a large amount of material from traditional services and represented a rather conservative reform. Now, just about the time things were really going well for the reformers, up comes Mary Tudor, the daughter of Henry VIII and his first queen, Catherine of Aragon, who of course was Spaniard. Mary ascended the throne, and Mary was staunchly Roman Catholic, and she tried to restore the English church to the state in which it had been prior to her father's break with Rome. Not much success there. It was an impossible task because, as we know, many of the churches and places of worship had been destroyed, and church lands were now in lay ownership. Henry got mad, as we all know, when he didn't get his way from the Pope. Mary's reign was brief, and the attempt came to an end with her death in 1558. Next in line, Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry and his second queen, Anne Boleyn. Everybody knows the story about Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth was reared in the Protestant household of her mother, Catherine Parr, and she halted Mary's Catholic Reformation within 6 months. She was not going to have any of that. She was truly a Protestant, and she refused to tolerate a church independent of the state or under a Roman pontiff. The 1559 Book of Common Prayer is inextricably bound to the political moveries of the first months of her reign. She and her advisors pursued their reform via the legal system, though. They were smart. But not all the Protestants felt that that was sufficient. There were still those crying for greater reform, and those were labeled by historians as Puritans or godly. These people felt that too much popishness remained in the Elizabethan Church. With her death in 1603, the next up was James VI of Scotland, and the Puritans were just thrilled that he ascended to the throne because they thought, oh, finally, our prayers have been answered. There's someone who's going to be sympathetic to our viewpoint. I did not know this until I did this project. The Church of Scotland was Presbyterian in polity, and it was hoped that the new king, who is now James I of England, would replace the Book of Common Prayer with the Scottish Book of Common Order. James, as any monarch's model would do, quickly referred this matter to someone else, the Hampton Court Conference, and the Moderate Book of Common Prayer of 1604 is a result of that conference. Now, during this time, there was a group of divines that came up under the leadership of a man named Bishop Lancelot Andrewes. That's very bishop-worthy, isn't it? Known as the Durham House Group. Bishop Andrewes and his colleagues began distancing themselves from continental Reformed theology because they preferred the authority of the ancient church fathers to the Reformation. And of course, they went back and preferred the Book of Common Prayer of 1549 rather than the 1552, 1559, or 1604 versions. James was a rather astute monarch, and he tried to keep balance among the English and the Scottish churches. Well, after James's death under his son Charles I, the Durham House Group continued in its ascendance, and their insistence on more conformity in ceremonial matters began to make opposition from the more radical, godly, or pro-Reformation clergy. By now, the Durham House Group included William Laud, who went on to become Archbishop of Canterbury. And they were accused by the reformers of, I love this, creeping popery. because they did things like rail the communion table. Eventually, believe it or not, Scotland invaded England over all this, and the resulting civil war led to the execution of Charles I. What came next? Well, the Commonwealth and Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell. That's what England was reduced to now. And a semi-Presbyterian state came into place. The 1604 Book of Common Prayer was replaced by the Westminster Directory, which was really just a book that provided an outline for services. And they actually outlawed the use of the Book of Common Prayer in 1645 in England. Cromwell's death led Parliament and the army to restore the monarchy under Charles II. In 1660, he issued what is called the Declaration of Breda, and he promised to grant liberty to tender consciences. And many of the Presbyterian-minded in the Church of England asked him not to restore the Book of Common Prayer without some modification of the ceremonies. His reply was to state that, as a true Englishman, the Book of Common Prayer was the best we have seen. Now, by March of 1661, a commission was ordered to deliberate when they settled everywhere else they went in the world. The first Holy Communion on American soil actually took place much earlier. It was in Jamestown on May the 14th of 1607. And it was led by an Anglican clergyman who was named Robert Hunt. And he was actually the chaplain of the Jamestown expedition. Now, as you might expect, some of the colonies adhered to English traditions, and some were populated by heirs of Puritan and nonconformist traditions. By the time of the War of Independence in the United States, many Episcopalians took the Loyalist side. English and even Scottish clergy had taken an oath of allegiance to the King of England, for whom prayers were ordered in all the regular prayer book services. After July 4th, 1776, many of them fled back to England or to Canada. It wasn't until 1785 when representatives of 7 states in the new America met in Philadelphia to consider the organization and constitution of an independent church that the question of revising the whole Book of Common Prayer began to be addressed. Previous revisions had been attempted, one in 1773 by Benjamin Franklin. There's like nothing he didn't do. And John Wesley had actually adopted the prayer book liturgy for Methodists shortly after the American Revolution. The book that emerged from the convention in Philadelphia contained changes that were favored by the evangelicals in the southern and middle states, many of which were unacceptable to the high church party, and certainly the bishops in England. References to the king and parliament were omitted, as well as the Nicene Creed. The sign of the cross was not required in some services, and clergy were never referred to as priests. In 1789, a general convention of the new church met in Philadelphia, and a modified version of the 1786 book was adopted. The Nicene Creed was restored, the prayer of consecration was lengthened, and some of the language was updated. And that book bore well for 100 years, and the next revision was not needed until 1892. The main reason there was a need for another revision was there had been a huge influx of immigrants, both to the factories and cities and towns, and to the remote missionary frontiers, so the long services were just no longer practical. Desires for a new book at this time were also influenced by the Catholic revival and Anglicanism, and it had with its renewed emphasis on the sacraments and its interest in the study of the liturgy in general. In the end, however, the 1892 revision turned out to be extremely conservative. The next revision wasn't until 1928, but the first steps toward that revision began at the General Convention in 1913. Now, this was a little too soon for the revision to be influenced very much by the beginnings of the liturgical movement in Europe, so once again, the changes were fairly conservative. But one of the most important decisions to come out of that convention was the establishment of a standing liturgical commission to prepare for future revisions of the prayer book. Next up, of course, 1979. By 1979, the church was changing more rapidly than ever. There was new architecture, new furniture, new Bible translations, new music. The new Bible translations led to the demise of the Tudor language, and everything just led to a radically different Book of Common Prayer. In the United States, in 1976, the General Convention took 2 steps at once, which were both opposed by the traditionalists. First, it gave provisional approval to the proposed prayer book, which thus became a lawful alternative to the 1928 Book of Common Prayer then in current use. And then secondly, the General Convention also legislated for the ordination of women as presbyters. Such radical changes called for a more comprehensive revision process, and the Standing Liturgical Commission undertook the production of a series of prayer book studies to test changes. This resulted in several trial versions